All right, it seems like we're at a critical mass here. Again, I'm Dan Ujczo. I'm an international trade and transportation attorney at Thompson Hine, based in the heart of North America here in Columbus, Ohio. Good afternoon, good morning, good day, no matter where you are. I just, on behalf of our team at Thompson Hine, whether here in Ohio or New York, Chicago, Atlanta, and of course, our excellent team in Washington, D.C., we welcome you, and we truly appreciate, in terms of gratitude for your being with us today, but also in terms of understanding just how challenging it is to get away from our ongoing sets of Zoom calls, webcast, WebEx, all of the things that we all have been doing for the last year and a half to take 90 minutes of your life to talk about navigating a new North America. I won't get into the subtitles. It's a bit of a long title. It's one of mine, as you know. Those of you that have been around my webinars know that they always start with the same letter. It's an alliteration thing. But with that, but thank you for being here and your most precious resource, your time. If you're with us today live, you want to talk about timing for a North American trade webinar. But if you're with us in the future, 1.21 gigawatts, Back to the Future, we'll see you on demand in a few days, or when you're on your treadmill, your lawnmower, whatever it is you're doing as you catch up with these things. And if we make any comments today that are not true in a few days or a week when you're listening to this, just forget we said it. Against that backdrop, there are a few housekeeping items. Everything's being recorded, so you'll get the link within 48 hours and a brief summary of what happened here. Additionally, all of the handouts, if you're in your control box, all of the handouts are listed: agendas, bios, copies of the PowerPoints, etc. Those also come with the recording as well. So you can sit back and relax, catch up on eating, catch up on emails, etc. while you're listening, and you don't have to furiously take notes. This is also being offered for continuing legal education credit. That handout is included as well in terms of what the procedures are. And of course, as CLE goes, you won't get the code until the end. So at the very end of this session, I'll give the code and you can submit per those instructions or according to your jurisdiction for doing so. So with that, we have an exciting, as I said, 90-minute program. We're energized, we're enthused today because now we have this expert and experienced panel, but it's a bit of a family reunion today. We're putting the band back together. It's been a while since we've been together. So many of our great organizations that are on the line, whether it's CUSBA in Detroit, the Canada-US Business Association, AmCham Canada, NASCO, Can-Am BTA, Council of Great Lakes Region. So many of our friends and family are with us today that were with us during the USMCA series that we held under a different banner. And here we are again. And what a great group of people we have to speak with us today. Not only experience and expertise, but also you can't find a better group of friends and people to work with on these various projects. I'm actually going to breach protocol as well as my Midwestern chivalry in terms of introducing the lineups and start in the order of appearance today, just so that folks can match bios with the order in which we hear. We have all of our speakers on video right now. And then as the session goes on, you will only see the video for the folks that are speaking. So that others, don't have any distracting things or can have some free time to stretch, what have you. But our first speaker is Sergio Gomez Lora. Sergio is the CEO of the Coordinating Council of Mexico in the DC office, which was opened toward the tail end of the USMCA negotiations. Sergio is also the CEO of IQOM, one of the leading trade consulting firms in Mexico. Suffice it to summarize, Sergio is the eyes, ears, and voice of the Mexican business community in Washington, as well as assisting U.S. companies with operations in Mexico as to what's happening there. Sergio is a true North American, born and raised in Mexico, educated in Mexico. Then I think it was just, wanted to get some cold. So he went up to Ottawa and Quebec, educated at Laval as well, and led or was part of Mexico's NAFTA office in Canada during the original NAFTA negotiations. He has an extensive career in the Mexican government. You pick the trade agreement he was involved, whether it's NAFTA's environmental and labor side agreements, Mexico's deals with Europe, and with countries throughout Latin America. He then came back, lived across the pond for a while, came back, has been in Houston and Washington, D.C. And one of the great things about IQOM is I've made the joke over the years that if you want to find a recovering trade negotiator from Mexico, just go to IQOM. but they not only bring that political and practical, or political and policy experience, but practical experience for our clients that are operating in the just-in-time environment, and there's really none better. And we thank you, Sergio, again for joining us today. Sergio will be followed by Andrea Van Vugt. Andrea got her start back in 1993 in Ontario politics during the original NAFTA negotiations. I always chuckle when I say that. She always gets mad at me for throwing that one in there. But had an extensive career in both Ontario and federal Canadian politics, spent time in the telecom industry as well as time in DC, went back to Canada and served as the longest serving foreign policy advisor to a Prime Minister of Canada during the Harper years, doing issues around the world, but chief among them dealing with the Canada-US relationships on issues like beyond the border and the Regulatory Cooperation Council. She was also chief of staff to the Minister of International Trade, where she was intimately involved with the now comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CETA, Canada's deal with the European Union, and many, many others, as Canada has extensive trade relationships around the globe with places like the Ukraine. When she left government, she came to the Business Council of Canada, Canada's Business Roundtable, and set the groundwork for their efforts in the early days of CUSMA, USMCA, TMEC. We'll use those terms interchangeably today. And then she went to Canada's largest retailer and was intimately involved in the USMCA CUSMA negotiations, and is now back as the global director at Harper and Associates, helping clients around the world, including here in North America. And we have worked extensively in the past year, particularly as Andrea has been a leader in finding PPE, setting up PPE manufacturing through here in North America and around the world as well. A lot of people are talking about that. Andrea's doing it, and it's great to have you here again, Andrea. And then last but certainly not least is Nadia Theodore. Nadia is the head of government relations, external relations, etc., at Maple Leaf Foods. Now, Maple Leaf Foods, of course, as its name implies, sounds Canadian. It's a great Canadian company, but operations throughout the United States. We actually have a lot of it here in the Midwest, but also global supply chains. There's nobody better to advise Maple Leaf on these issues than Nadia. She goes back more than 20 years working in the trade policy and negotiations branch at DFATE Global Affairs Canada, extensive experience on a number of trade deals, including as serving as the deputy chief negotiator during the CPTPP and the executive director of the CETA of the Canada, again, Canada's agreement with the European Union Secretariat. During those times, many of us know Nadia as probably the most prolific and famous consul general history, where she served as Canada's consul general in Atlanta, but for all of the southeastern United States. Got there right about the time we were renegotiating a trade agreement, some hurricanes and many other things, and not only was a force of nature there here in the United States and the Canada-US relationship, but also helped so many of our companies, our clients, working and connecting those with Canadian companies and Canadian companies investing in the United States. And it's just wonderful to have you as well, Nadia, with us. Our lineup is Sergio, Andrea, Nadia. As I said, each of our speakers are going to address the issue. Since many of us came together, a lot has changed. Number one, we were talking last year about this time right as the pandemic hit. So each of our speakers is going to touch a bit as what's going on with COVID, borders on their issues. Of course, since the last time we talked, we now have a new trade agreement that's fully in force. USMCA, CUSMA, AMEC, TMEC, whatever acronym or initialism that you like to use, but each of our speakers will be talking about USMCA. I've said for a while now, USMCA was a bit like a 2020 wedding. But the parties got formally hitched on July 1st of 2020, but we didn't have the reception in the party. And part of that's because we had maximum flexibility, restrained enforcement, et cetera. Well, that's all changing. So USMCA is in full force and effect, and we're going to see a lot of that as we go into Q2, Q3. And just convenient with our webinar, a few labor cases were filed this week, among other issues. We also had an election in the United States. A number of those issues, whether it's Buy American, whether it's issues on energies, an interesting day to be holding this, as well as we're talking about pipelines today in Canada, US. I'm sure Andrea will talk a bit about that. But also as we look at North American supply chains and all of these executive orders and studies that are being done right now, it looks a lot like 2017, to be candid with you, when the Trump administration started launching studies into 232 steel and aluminum, 301 tariff. They were doing the homework, and that's what the Biden-Harris administration is doing now on a number of these issues, and all of those roads seem to be leading. Those reports will be issued at some point this summer, toward the end of the summer, early fall as well, and that'll be the playbook for where we're going on trade. And of course, we'll talk about some of the future issues as you look at a new energy economy. What are things like border adjustment taxes going to look like? So there's a lot to cover here. As I said at the outset, there's nobody better than this group of speakers. We're each going to talk for about 7 to 15 minutes. Sergio will kick us off, but we are leaving an extensive period of time, about 30 to 40 minutes for Q&A. You can put your Q&A into the question and answer session, and we'll kind of aggregate those and pick out key themes and ask our speakers about that during a moderated Q&A. Don't worry, we won't say your name or anything like that. Those will be relatively anonymous. Nobody's going to call you out, but we'll kind of group those together as we get into the Q&A. So with that, I turn it over to you, Sergio. And I invite the other speakers to turn off their cameras as well if they'd like while Sergio is speaking.
Thank you very much, Dan, for this kind introduction and for putting this seminar together. Thanks a lot to Thompson Hine for inviting me to be here with you today. It's a pleasure to be again sharing a panel as I've done for several times, Andrea, with you, and Nadia, is a pleasure. Today I will divide my presentation, focus on what's going on in Mexico and how is the USMCA moving things in Mexico. I will divide my presentation in 4 areas. Number 1, we'll make a quick look at what's going on in Mexico. Secondly, we will look at some of the challenges that this new North America is posing to Mexico and to the region. Obviously, we'll look also to the opportunities that we're facing, and I will end with some final comments. So let's start right away with what's going on in Mexico. The first thing to understand of Mexico for the next weeks is we have a huge midterm election, and I say huge. All elections are very important. This one is major in terms of it's all the House is being under election, and 15 governorships. As you all know, today in Mexico we have an administration that has full control of both houses, Senate and Chamber of Deputies, in terms of they have a simple majority. This election could change that into a supermajority that could provide for constitutional changes. That is certainly the objective of the government. Today they have now, with the coalition they work to, over a little bit over the 300 deputies they in their pocket. They would need 334 for constitutional amendments, so that's their goal. It's a difficult task. It's not clear if they're gonna achieve that, but that's clearly their aim. On the governorships, 15 governors, half of the states in the country are having government elections also. And in terms again of moving the constitution, well, you'll need 18 local congresses to change constitution. So this is clearly one of the key issues at stake during the current election, June 6th. So if for some of you that have heard about President López Obrador mañaneras, his morning talk with the press, a couple of hours, sometimes more, reviewing the agenda, well, these days are everything but the elections. Can we go to the next one, please? Other element to consider in Mexico: how are we doing regarding the pandemic and the industrial activity? The Mexican government has decided to create a lights with colors to identify what the situation is for each one of the the states in terms of the pandemic and the activity that can be undertaken. Red one being the maximum alert, green one being the lowest level. The good news is we have most of the states in low and medium level, no state at red, couple of states in dark yellow. So basically for these states, the 3 states that we have it's more orange, we have essential and non-essential activities are permitted, but at reduced level. In Chihuahua in the north, heavily industrial state, export-oriented industries there. The activity is at 80%, for example, aerospace and auto. In Puebla, which is an important part of the automotive cluster, activity is sometimes limited to 50%. And for the rest of the country, industrial activity is basically opening, all open and working fine. Next, please. The last element I will address regarding what's going on in Mexico is a quite controversial and very recently approved law in Mexico regarding outsourcing. Just at the end of April, it was passed by Mexican Congress, and basically what is this law states is that outsourcing is forbidden. That is the main principle. Companies are not able to outsource services unless the services are not part of the main economic activities. In Mexico, when you establish the bylaws and you create your company, you in your bylaws you indicate what are the main activities that your company has, that is known as a corporate purpose. So you cannot outsource any activity that is related to your, or is part of your corporate purpose. The logic behind this was that the government believed that some companies were not giving the full labor benefits to employees because they were treating them as outsourced and not as full-time employees. So they decided to go this way. This law will be in force, fully implemented by September 2021. So if you have operations in Mexico, you will have to then make a review of your bylaws, your corporate structure, and make sure that whatever services you outsource are not part of your corporate purpose. I leave it here in terms of what's going in Mexico. So if we can go to the next slide, we will now look a little bit of to the USMCA. What is going on in North America? Well, first I would say that USMCA has gone off to a rocky start. Why is that? Well, several controversial measures adopted by governments have been out there. The most visible in energy on the Mexican side, reforms to the electricity and the oil and gas sectors, but also some measures on the labeling, food labeling, some changes to the government procurement laws, some new regulations for digital services and for importation of corn, GMO, and glyphosate. The ones of you that were hearing this morning or were listening this morning to Ambassador Tai hearing in the Senate in the US in the Finance Committee, you heard about these issues. There were a lot of questions from the senators. On the US side, there are also some measures that which not necessarily, or is not very clear their compatibility with this letter of spirit of the agreement. So this is clearly a relevant issue. These measures have to be brought to compatibility in order to provide the USMCA with the credibility as the instrument that is governing the economic and the trade relation between the parties. So that is an issue that is out there that I was not able to talk about the USMCA without addressing this. I've been asked, next please, I've been asked to talk a little bit about the energy reforms. Long story short, Mexico, for over 80 years, by constitution, had only one player in the oil and gas and electricity sectors. This one player was in both in the oil and gas, the state-owned enterprise Pemex, and in the electricity sector, CFE, again a state-owned enterprise, who was the only entity authorized to commercialize or produce these goods. On 2014, there was a constitutional change. Private players were brought into the picture and now authorized Mexican and foreign to participate in the market. And recently, there has been some reforms that modified this participation. On the electricity law, there was an electricity law presented by government and approved by Congress and entering in force in March. There have been a couple of reforms on the oil and gas sector. One already in force since May, the other pending, approved by Congress and pending publication. This is the two reforms that have been put in place by this administration, modify the terms of the previous one. So and there has not been any modification to the Constitution. So there are judicial challenges. These energy reforms are in Mexican courts under review. Some judges have already temporarily suspended the application of the reforms, but this might most probably go to the Supreme Court. So this is what is going on in the energy sector. If we can go to the next one, please. What else is going in terms of the USMCA? We cannot talk about USMCA without speaking about labor. My perspective is that there were three major changes from NAFTA to USMCA. One was the auto rules of origin that are more strict. Second one was the establishment of a review clause that will review, governments will review the agreement every 6 years. And the third one is labor. And the USMCA is by far the strongest agreement in terms of labor content. And now we have, as you know, a Democrat administration in the US, which has clearly indicated that labor is a priority. So it was not a surprise for us that early this administration, they started this week, we had the two first cases of the brand new labor mechanism, rapid response mechanism. This is a mechanism that was established under the new agreement, and this mechanism, by the first time under an agreement in North America, would let, if a panel decides against that there's a denial of rights on a specific plant operating in the region, there can be penalties directly imposed to plants. So the first case was, the first complaint was presented Monday against a firm in the north of Mexico. The U.S. government, this is a firm that produces auto parts for the repair market. The U.S. government has 30 days to study the complaint. If they find that the complaint has enough merit, they will ask the Mexican government to start an investigation, and the Mexican government will have 55 days to do the investigation and to find a solution. If there's not a solution, a panel could be convened. So this is the first one. You see some of the reactions. This is a very politically sensitive issue. Democrats are supported a lot the inclusion of these kind of mechanisms in the agreement. So it's not a surprise that the Ways and Means Committee and the Finance Committee in the Senate are out there applauding this first complaint. The second one, if we can go to the next slide, was announced just this morning. The USTR, this is a complaint started by the US government. So, and this is a complaint against a plant, General Motors plants in the center of Mexico. Since this is a complaint presented by the government, then the time frame to address it is shorter. There will be only 45 days to agree on a solution, because the government has already indicated that this has merit, the US government. So the Mexican government is going to review and then come back to the US with a potential solution to avoid the creation of a patent. So this is the new world. The USMCA with the labor dispute settlement that is very easy to trigger and very expedite in terms of the time frame to make decisions, governments to react, and panels to be convened. And at the end of the day, this could, the final penalty could be a tariff to the specific plant that is under the review. So I leave it here for what is the USMCA. And if we can go to, well, yeah, before leaving the USMCA, we had the following days will be very active in terms of USMCA. We had this morning the Senate Finance hearing, the Committee on Finance, the trade agenda. So it was Ambassador Tai explaining and discussing with senators and with the committee responsible for trade in the Senate what is the agenda for the US on trade. USMCA was a big part of these discussions today. Labor was one of them, or some of the measures that I described at the beginning were also part of these discussions. Senators were asking the USTR what the action that the administration is going to undertake to correct these measures. Tomorrow we will have a similar discussion. Ways and Means Committee on that will be this is the House, and we are having Ambassador Tai again having a discussion this time with the members of the Ways and Means Committee at the House. And if this was not enough of USMCA, next week we'll have the most important meeting of the USMCA. That is a yearly meeting that the three ministers, this time three ladies, will hold to review how are we doing in terms of USMCA implementation. This is a 2-day meeting, 1 day and a half. There will be an exhaustive review of issues. So interesting opportunity for the ministers to provide guidance on next steps to move the agreement towards strengthening integration and competitiveness in the region. All right, so very rapidly, these are some of the challenges, the measures that are out there that might not be compatible with the agreement. And clearly the labor front is going to be, for those of you that have operations in Mexico, is going to be an issue. The Ambassador Tai not only said it today, but has said it since the beginning, since the day she was nominated. And I think President Biden has been strong on this too. Trade policy has a very important focus in this administration on labor, and implementation of labor obligation of the USMCA are a big part of that. So we will hear a lot on cases and labor in the following days and months to come. But those are the challenges. So what are the opportunities? Well, as you all know, there is a combination of international developments that have created an opportunity for the region. One is obviously this trade war between China and the US, which started last administration, but this administration inherited, but the duties are there, and the reading here in DC is that these duties will be there for a while. So there is that situation where products coming from China are more expensive now in the US market, both final goods and inputs. And on the other hand, well, this pandemic brought also the issue that having a supply chain that is far away could pose risks in situations such as the one that we've suffered with COVID-19. So companies as yours are evaluating the risk they have and making decisions on how to mitigate such risk. So this combination of developments has created an opportunity to review what economic activities can be brought to North America that today are not in North America. Can we go to the next one, please? In particular, the Biden administration has started a review, what they call a critical supply chains review. And there is an executive order from late February that have instructed the administration agencies to work in two fronts. First, 4 sectors that have been indicated as a priority, where a 100-day review should be conducted, and the agencies in charge, which are there, should are mandated to present a report on what are the vulnerabilities for these key 4 sectors. Semiconductor, Department of Commerce, Department of Energy is looking at large capacity batteries, including for electric cars. Department of Defense is looking at critical minerals, and Department of Health is looking at pharmaceutical ingredients. But this is just the first part, and there is a June 4th deadline for the administration to present a first report of where are the gaps. There is a second part, which is a much more ambitious review in terms of the sectors included, that will that is mandated to have a first report by February next year. And this is, as you can see in this slide, almost every sector. You have defense, transportation, energy, public health, so not only pharmaceuticals, but everything, medical equipment, information and communication technology, and food and agriculture. So basically, the U.S. government is engaging into a full review of the supply chains. There is obviously a fear about the dependence on far supply chains and there are countries that are not necessarily trusted allies. So there is an opportunity under this review for North America to come out with a stronger supply chain and more economic activities to be developed here. Next one. I don't know how I am doing on time, but I will go very quickly into the next slides. So I will just point out that we have done an analysis of some opportunities and we have found interesting things. This is the semiconductor value chain. I will go very fast. I will just mention that there are segments of this chain, research, design, that are high intensive in research of development. There is in manufacturing, there is a segment of the supply chain that is very intensive in capital, and there's another one that is less intensive in capital and more intensive in labor. For the moment, this supply chain is strongly based in Asia. There's no strong participation in North America. In the case of Mexico, we believe that there is an opportunity in the short term to move, at least on the first step, to the back end of the supply chain of manufacturing, where there is this assembly, packaging, and testing of semiconductors. I will not go in detail because I think I'm running out of time, but we have done the same analysis for the other sectors. In the high capacity batteries, we have also found an area of opportunities in this supply chain. There's a segment where Mexico can play a stronger role. And in the next one, you'll see the same, which is in the pharmaceutical industry. Most of the APIs are produced in China or India. So there is also a role that we could play there. I will leave it there for the moment in this section and go to my final comments. Just mentioning number one, it is very important that the USMCA is duly implemented and obligations are fulfilled, because the credibility of the agreement is at risk. We have to go out there with a strong agreement. Enforcement is key. Labor risk deserves special attention. For the one of you that have operations in Mexico, take a very, very close look to that one. Reshoring supply chains overly brings opportunity. How can we help? And this is my last comment, Dan. IQOM, the firm I represent, could help. First, as you've seen, there's several changes in Mexico, very, very sometimes deep and very fast changes, because this administration have a different view of the economic agenda as others. So we can help you have an updated, very quick, real-time monitoring of the changes in Mexico that would affect your firm. We engage with federal governments and local governments in terms to map and identify and improve the conditions for the investments in Mexico. We have identified already some opportunities on the supply chain. We can do this in other sectors. And we have a tool that I don't think I'll have time to describe now, but we can do it maybe in the Q&A, where we have developed a methodology to mitigate the labor risk, where we identify what are the gaps that your operation could have in terms of the labor obligation of the agreements, and we implement a strategy to cover those gaps before you get a bad surprise, as we can see some of those surprises already out there. I leave it here. Dan, I thank you very much. I hope this was useful, and I'll be around if there are any Q&As at some time.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Sergio. That was a fantastic presentation, and it's a fantastic tool on the labor aspects as well. So thank you. That was a perfect way to tee up. As you all have seen, not only Sergio covered a lot what's happening in Mexico with USMCA, as well as here in the United States. So it was a perfect way to start this presentation. So thank you, Sergio. I'll now turn it over to Andrea to give us the perspective from the Canadian side as well. And so over to you, Andrea.
Thanks very much, Dan. It's as Dan started off with, I think it's always a joy and a pleasure to be with friends, especially in these days with COVID, where we don't get to be together in person, but I hope that day is coming soon. But Nadia and Dan and Sergio are folks that I worked with for years on North American issues, and it's great to be with all of them, as well as many friends that I know are watching today. I think Sergio laid an excellent foundation for the sort of the status of USMCA and some of the key dates and processes that are underway. So I won't repeat that, but I think I'd like to offer a number of observations about implementation, but also about what's sort of happening in the meantime with respect to North America. So, you know, just to remember, when we concluded, when we began USMCA, you know, the expectation of how we would modernize the trade relationship within North America, we thought we'd all accomplished under TPP. And with the election of President Trump and the rhetoric around NAFTA, we quickly found ourselves renegotiating NAFTA as part of USMCA, which wasn't perhaps negative until we actually got into the negotiations, and Canada found that it was far more a target than we were originally expecting. That being said, we got through those negotiations successfully, concluded what I believe is a strong foundational agreement for the future. We were able to modernize a number of the provisions within NAFTA that improved the way that our three countries function together. There were obviously some gaps, some missed opportunities. Some of that was because of restrictions placed on negotiators by Congress, like we weren't able to discuss labor or immigration really in a good way. And when I refer to labor, I do mean with respect to immigration. Obviously, Congress paid particular attention to the labor provisions with respect to Mexico. And I think that is a really interesting point with respect to the deal, is that I believe more than any other agreement, Congress will be paying a very, very close attention to the implementation of USMCA, which perhaps we won't have seen before. You'll see a different situation in Canada. I think because of those dynamics that I spoke about at the beginning with respect to how Canada thought we'd modernized as part of TPP, yet we found ourselves in the USMCA negotiations and a bit more of a target than we were expecting. It wasn't really a negotiation that Canada was calling for. And so as a result, I think what we've seen through the negotiations, but also with respect to implementation, is a bit of a difference with respect to the promotion of the agreement and a promotion of the implementation of the agreement. It's not being heralded in the same way as a number of other trade agreements Canada has signed have been. And I do think that Canada is trying to wrap its arms around how to ensure, especially in the time of COVID, how we support Canadian companies that right now are trying to figure out how to keep their doors open, but how to support Canadian companies understand how to implement USMCA, but also take advantage of the framework of agreements that are now available to Canadians. You've got different rules of origin, you've got different tariff preferences, you've got different quotas. Putting that all together, knitting it all together for Canadian companies, I think is going to be a key focus of Canada's Trade Department and something that's going to be essential going forward to ensure that we don't end up in a situation where other countries are able to take greater advantage of Canada than we are. I think, though, I'm reminded of the saying that, where you begin and where you end doesn't really tell the full story. And I think we've seen that with all of our other trade deals. One of the key elements of success for USMCA is going to be what happens with respect to implementation, what happens with respect to all of these requests for consultations that we're beginning to see, but how we fill our panels. But it's also what happens outside of USMCA. So we've all agreed, we've come together, we've all agreed on a number of measures, but there are things that all three countries are doing in the meantime, outside of the framework of the agreement, that will have a direct impact on how companies interact with Canada. And I'll talk about Canada in particular because obviously I'm more knowledgeable about Canada, but I think that you can see examples where each of the three countries are taking action domestically on certain elements that were not contemplated or covered as part of USMCA. And so that's why I refer back to sometimes, it's what happens in between that's almost more important, that can cause more challenge and trouble for Canadian companies who are looking to invest or sell its products into the United States or into Mexico or vice versa. And so what does that look like with respect to Canada? So in Canada, you've seen the Trudeau government carry forth a strong agenda with respect to a ban on plastics. So obviously, serious implications with respect to packaging and single-use products and how US companies are going to come into compliance with respect to that supply. You've also seen digital sales tax, which essentially covers anyone who's using a platform, an online platform, to either sell apps or products into Canada, to ensure that companies that are doing so from abroad are complying with our domestic sales tax federally and provincially. And you've seen recent legislation with respect to that in our budget that was introduced just a few weeks ago. You also have other elements that are not necessarily trade related, but will have an impact for US companies or Mexican companies trading with or operating in Canada, including our privacy legislation, which is generating a fair bit of attention right now. But in addition to that, you've got bilateral issues. So it's not just those domestic pieces that Canada is taking forward, but then layered on top of that are certain bilateral initiatives between Canada and the United States, which are extremely important as we position ourselves in the world. So you've got bilateral working groups on things like critical minerals, on a climate roadmap, on, while not a formal conversation, you've got some alignment on this notion of a carbon border adjustment tax. And I perhaps will pause there and just, make a comment about the fact that in areas where there is ideological alignment between the two governments, I think we're going to see significant progress. And so what does that look like? What does that mean? In this respect, between Canada and the United States, I think that you're going to see, and it's quite clear out of the roadmap that was released following Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden's virtual bilat a couple of months ago. I think you're going to see a strong agenda with respect to climate. And this isn't, this isn't breaking news, but it does mean that on issues with respect to the climate change agenda, you are going to see these items move more ambitiously and aggressively forward than other items that perhaps are not as aligned. And so, on the typical irritants that we see between our countries, like dairy is a good example where, the Trump administration initiated a consultation under USMCA that will get carried forward under the Biden administration, partly, again, like labor, because of pressure from Congress. But, other conversations like softwood lumber, although right now I'm not sure that anyone in the softwood lumber industry is actually looking for a resolution to the issue given the price of lumber these days. But you've also got other irritants like things like Buy American. And so where there's ideological alignment, I think we're going to see great progress. But on some of those other bilateral issues where there are domestic political agendas at play, I think it's going to be a bumpier road. But certainly the nature of those conversations, and to coin one of Dan's phrases, the tone and tenor of those conversations is going to be dramatically different than what we would have seen under the previous administration. But, there is an asterisk on that point with respect to the climate. There are, today is a very appropriate day for today's webinar because of activity surrounding Line 5 and the Enbridge project that brings extremely important resources into the Michigan area. And of course, we would have seen, the unfortunate decision around Keystone. I think it's equally important for our administrations to have a conversation on climate, but also to recast what an energy partnership is between our two countries. Ideally, that would be a trilateral conversation, although I think our friends in Mexico have a slightly different agenda with regard to that aspect. There are also some multilateral issues that will come to play where I think there is increasing alignment between Canada and the United States, and that would be on things like, a global tax, and again, the carbon border adjustment tax. And on those issues, I think what will be particularly interesting to watch is the role that Canada and the United States play at the WTO. The question about whether or not the WTO is an agenda setter, whether the members of the WTO are agenda setters, is going to be called into question here. Because as you start to see a majority, or at least perhaps not a majority, because we could do a whole webinar on how these multilateral institutions are influenced. I think when you start to see heavy hitters as part of the WTO membership take a role on things like a carbon border adjustment tax or the notion of a global minimum tax, it's going to confront some of those issues that certain countries believe provide an unfair trading advantage. And in effect, a subsidy to countries that don't respect certain climate policies, like China or Russia. I think just transitioning to COVID for just a minute, I think we've seen tremendous cooperation between Canada and the United States to ensure that our border stays open and, effectively moving goods, where we need to turn our mind to, and I'm confident that these conversations are happening, but I think all of us would like them to happen faster, is this notion of reopening the border to people and the movement of people between Canada and the United States. This is a tricky subject in Canada in particular, because we have some pressure from other parties in the country that are both in government and in opposition that are calling on the federal government to not reopen the border. But I do think that speaks to the need for greater, it speaks to the need for a conversation like we had after 9/11, or as we had between Prime Minister Harper and President Obama when we did Beyond the Border. We need a border agenda to capture what's happening at this time. And it will be a shift, right? Not focused on the secure movement of goods, but the safe movement of people. And I think that that's desperately needed. There's also, you know, in the COVID umbrella, the conversation about how we make products together so that none of our countries are left caught without the necessary equipment to keep our people safe, things like ventilators and PPE, and happy to answer any questions on what's happening with respect to that. And one would certainly also like to see a greater agenda on regulatory cooperation, and perhaps healthcare is an area where we could start. Sergio started with the political dynamics in Mexico, so I will end with some of the political dynamics in Canada. We have a minority government in Canada. For my friends abroad who don't really need to know the intricacies of minority government, it simply means that we could find ourselves in a federal election really at any time. All of the parties have avoided an election through the pandemic, and we don't expect that there will be a federal election within the next couple of months. I do, though, believe that we will see a federal election before the end of the year. And so, despite everything I've just said about cooperation and collaboration between our administrations, you know, there will be some question as to how that will continue. Certainly if there's another minority government, but even more so if there's a change in government. I won't quarterback what I think might happen in the next election, but certainly we'll want to keep an eye on that with respect to what the agenda will be with respect to North America. So Dan, I think on that note, I'll hand it back to you so that we can continue on. Thanks.
Great, great. Thanks, Andrea. And that's a great summary of what's happening in Canada. There's just so much activity going on, both again on the politics, on the policy, on the practicalities. Thank you for that. Just as Andrea, or excuse me, as Nadia turns on her camera and microphone, we'll just as a reminder to some folks, go ahead and put your questions. I know that we have a pretty full deck right now, and we'll work to get to those. Also, a lot of questions about the presentation. They're in the handouts section, so you're welcome to download those on your control panel. And those will also come with the recording in the next 48 hours or so as well. So without further ado, over to you, Nadia, and let's hear what's happening from the company perspective and your broad, as always, experience and expertise. It's so great to see you, and look forward to hearing from you.
It's nice to see you, Dan, on the screen, and great to be here with you all. I am not going to talk about politics, nor am I going to talk about any one country's views with regards to NAFTA 2.0, the North American relationship, or USMCA. You know, now in my new role, less than a year in with Maple Leaf Foods, I now get the opportunity to sort of talk a little bit about maybe a little bit more of the practical piece when it comes to the North American relationship. But, I also thought what I would do is provide a little bit of maybe, blue skying, a little bit of visioning around, what we might want to think of when we think about what the future of North America could really be. And I think in that regard, I'm gonna sort of riff off of what Sergio and Andrea already sort of teed up for me. And in the interest of time, won't take a lot of time, but I thought that, the two issues around regulatory cooperation or harmonization, depending on how you look at it, and then the whole issue around border carbon adjustment is one that I would love to talk more about in the conversation piece of this program and the Q&A piece of this program. So I'll offer a couple of thoughts on that from an agri-food perspective. And from an overall company perspective. But before I do that, if you will allow me, and I apologize that I don't have a nice slide for you to look at. And of course, I'm not going to talk about politics, so I'll be less interesting than both Sergio and Andrea combined, and you'll just get my face. But I do want to tell you a little bit about Maple Leaf Foods, because I suspect that many who are listening in might not know what Maple Leaf Foods is. And when I talk about the company, I kind of like to break it into two pieces: what we do and who we are. And I do that in particular when I'm talking about the North American relationship, because I think it'll fit nicely, and hopefully you'll see what I mean as I kind of go through it quickly. So, you know, basically we are we produce high quality prepared meats, value added pork, chicken, turkey, and plant-based protein. We have facilities, like Dan said at the beginning, off the top, across Canada and in the United States. And, you know, for over 100 years in Canada, and most recently in the United States, we've really been kind of a staple on Canadian breakfast tables, in school lunches, you know, summer night barbecues. But we also have a global footprint. You know, we do business in over 20 markets. And the trade policy geek in me always likes to say that we are Canadian born, but globally made at Maple Leaf Foods. And truly at the heart of that global footprint is the North American partnership. And what we all know is grounded in what used to be the North American Free Trade Agreement and is now the Usmca. And then, you know, in years to come, hopefully will really just be about a true North American partnership. And then there's who we are kind of as a company, right? So as a company, we are a team of over 13,000 employees. We kind of have a purpose for a company. We're a very purpose-driven company. You know, our motto is to raise the good in food. And we kind of have 4 principles or pillars around which our company is built around. And it's better food. So we make food with real ingredients. Better care, which is our commitment to be an industry leader in animal care. Better communities. We are very focused and relentless about our culture around safety, food safety, people safety, a culture and environment that really is around keeping our people safe while they're at work, and keeping our food safe for our communities to eat and enjoy. And then finally, a better planet. So we have an ambitious goal of reducing our environmental footprint by 50% by 2025. And, you know, I took the time sort of to kind of highlight those 4 principles and 4 pillars because I personally think, from a company perspective, and in particular, when you think about where global companies are going with regard to their vision, their ambition, their global brand, I do think that those pillars of who companies are going to define how they choose and how they want to do business. And I personally think that in North America, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, we can really use our relationship and the promise of the USMCA and what it was supposed to and what it can bring to help us to continue to achieve and deliver on those fundamentals at Maple Leaf Foods. And so I thought I would maybe just, again, in the interest of time, maybe I'll highlight 2 issues in particular, like I said. And one, of course, is decades old. We've been talking about regulatory cooperation for a very, very long time. And then the second one is new-ish, but, you know, rooted in discussions that have been going on for some time, perhaps known by other names, and I'll maybe provide a few thoughts on that. So on regulatory cooperation, you know, again, maybe just to focus it, on agri-food, and in particular on one of those pillars that I talked about for Maple Leaf Foods, and that is this idea of a culture of safety and the whole idea of food safety in particular. You know, when at Maple Leaf Foods as a company, or the agri-food industry in particular, in general, when we think about food safety in the North American context, right now, we really do understand that it is imperative to work to address and manage those issues jointly. The idea of and the concept of One Health is something that has been growing in importance over the past several years, and it's this idea that the health of people, the environment, animals, are all kind of inextricably linked, and the North American supply chain and the extensive cross-border integration of our supply chains really is evidence of that. And in the food and beverage sector in particular, it makes this idea of working together to address regulatory issues and manage regulatory issues jointly that much more important. And so, you know, concretely, in terms of a next step for this North American integration, this North American regulatory integration, to me, it's really about leveling up the work. You know, we do have the Canada-US RCC, the Regulatory Cooperation Council. I thought I was going to forget the name for a second because I always use the acronym. And you know, when we have work programs on food safety and animal, plant, and healthcare, and meat inspection that work under the RCC, but we can really level that up when we talk about the future of a North American partnership and visioning what North America looks like from an agri-food perspective in the future. And one concrete idea that is not my own, colleagues from CAPI, which is the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, and the Wilson Center, had brought forward years ago this idea of a food safety risk assessment organization. And in my view, that is something that could really be revisited. Of course, it would be focused on agri-food, but the concept of it could actually be replicated across a variety of sectors, because the idea is really to bring together kind of all of the back of the house, backdoor technical risk assessment functions that happen between that happen in our regulatory bodies, and create a kind of a formal institutional partnership. And of course, you know, I haven't spoken to them about why they came up with this idea, but I would imagine that it's really because of what Andrea was talking about when she spoke, you know, and when you relate it to agri-food in particular, having disjointed scientific efforts, parallel processes that are parallel but different, often really do lead to outcomes that are suboptimal and that are felt by businesses every day. And the differences, of course, have economic impact, but of course, more importantly, for most of us on the business front, really lead to competitive disadvantages and competitive distortions when we are, as Andrea rightly said, we're not able to sort of equally benefit, right? And in our world, it's equally benefit from newer, safer, more cost-effective technologies across borders. And when companies can sort of innovate in one country but not sell in another, even when we're serving the same customers, the same retail customers, the same food service customers. So I'll leave it there for regulatory quote because I'm conscious of the time. And then just quickly on the border carbon adjustment. You know, I would echo everything that Andrea said in terms of, you know, the ability for Canada and the United States in particular to really use the next however long this incarnation of these two governments last, and because Canada is obviously in a minority government. And I would just say two things. I would say that at the heart of it, is this idea, and I think that the reason that this idea of a border carbon adjustment is regaining in popularity of discussion is because there's a recognition that all countries recognize that we do need to urgently deal with issues around tackling climate change, for sure. And of course, Maple Leaf Foods, we're unapologetic about our commitment to sustainability. We were the first major food company in the world to become carbon neutral. Our goal is to be the most sustainable protein company on earth. We're all in. But we also recognize and think it's very important to remain competitive. And that competitiveness, and I think that countries recognize this as well, leaders of countries recognize this as well, is equally important. And you really do need to balance the two and make sure that your companies are not put at a disadvantage, at an unfair disadvantage because of climate policies or lack thereof. And in that regard, to Andrea's point about leadership at the World Trade Organization and other international fora, we have tried before to use trade policy tools to address issues around trade and around environment and sustainability. I still have the scars of being Canada's lead at the WTO trade and environment discussions and the APEC negotiations for liberalization of environmental goods and services. And, we didn't get very far. But I will say that what we did right, and what I think that we need to be mindful of doing right when we talk about border carbon adjustments, is this idea of having a multilateral solution and really working together, countries, states, together with companies, being very closely side by side with each other in these discussions. Because I do think that, it becomes very hard to have adjustments at the border if they're only imposed unilaterally or ad hoc by individual countries. And in that regard, I think that there's a great opportunity for Canada, US, and Mexico as a North American bloc to kind of work together on that solution that we then take forward to the wider multilateral community to discuss more fulsomely. So I'll leave it there in the interest of time and welcome the discussion on it.
Well, thanks, Nadia. And that's a perfect segue, I think, and from the company perspective and your own experience. I would invite all the speakers during the Q&A to camera up and smile, because we do have a ton of questions that we'll get to. I'll just remind everybody that's listening, and thank you for staying with us. I think the overwhelming majority have stayed with us past the 60 minutes, which is almost unheard of these days. Sergio, if you want to camera up, if you can, my friend. If not, we'll just hear from you from the darkness. But also, just a few housekeeping, that some of you have indicated you can't see Sergio's presentation on your handouts. We'll make sure you get those. Everybody will get that as it goes out into the world in the next 24 to 48. So if you don't have it, don't sweat it. You'll get it. And he's agreed to share that with everybody again. And as you saw, it's real time. I mean, there was stuff in there from this morning, so as we were all pulling the midnight oil on these labor claims. Let me just start with a few of the questions. If you do have additional questions, please go ahead and send them in. But we do have a pretty full vote here over the next 20 minutes or so. But I'm just struck by Nadia's comments from the private sector perspective, and what we deal with at Thompson Hine with our clients every day is, we can get this right. We can do something right on something like regulatory cooperation. And if there's anywhere that can really do that, it's certainly Canada, US, and probably North America. But we didn't really get there, right? We didn't, and Maple Leaf was such a leader in that, as was Nadia. But there's still a lot of work to do on regulatory co-op. And we do have these issues like border carbon adjustment tax or whatever acronym you want to use on that are going to require us to work together. But then rewind back to where we started today on USMCA or CUSMA. You know, companies right now have to deal with the reality of USMCA. But my question, you know, it's the law of the land right now, right? So we have found that companies that are using this are seeing great benefits, particularly in polymers, chemicals, plastics. You know, if you're bringing raw materials in and mixing them, formulating and doing things here, it's a great deal. It's when you're bringing in semi-finished products, particularly from China, that life becomes a little bit tricky. But I'll just start here, and it takes about 5 or 6 questions that folks have asked. Does USMCA matter? Let me recast that a little bit. I mean, Andrea, you've talked a little bit about how you know, we're not seeing the same rollout as we have for other deals because it wasn't necessarily the Canadian government's deal, right? This was kind of forced on them. But when everybody got in, they got in. Same with Mexico to some degree. It wasn't really AMLO's deal. It's everybody else's. Do you see the respective governments kind of working around USMCA and starting their own initiatives and kind of forgetting about that there's a significant body of work here? And it just becomes basically a dispute fora on labor and other issues? Or do we ever see the kind of NAFTA plus things that were the big selling points of USMCA, competitiveness? You can kind of go down the list, digital, et cetera. Do we ever get to that part of it, the good part, if you will? Or is USMCA going to really be about labor disputes or environmental disputes at the end of the day? And you can just waive whoever wants that one first. But it seems to me that we kind of have this distinction here. We got a lot of work to do. We could use it, but it doesn't seem like we're going to get there anytime soon. So Sergio, thank you for politely waiving and taking this one head on.
Yes, I think we'll have a first answer to that done on May 18, once the Free Trade Commission ends. I see a lot of focus of this administration in the U.S. on labor, and that worries me. Not because of the specific commitments on labor, but because they might not have in the priority the rest of the agenda. But having said that, I see that the 3 private sectors have a role into pushing this agenda. I see that the Canadian, Mexican, and private sectors have to go together. We have been together talking with the Business Roundtable, with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, with the Business Council of Canada about these things. So I think we have to make sure that if there is not a strong signal coming out on May 18 from the Commission on this agenda, the private sectors push for this agenda to be included.
Maybe I could jump in. I think a bunch of things on this subject. I mean, you can do a whole other webinar on whether or not, you know, you'll ever see a North American Leaders Summit or whether or not North America matters anymore. I think that the trade deal is great, sets out a set of rules, it modernizes some dispute processes, it reaffirms the fact that we do believe that North America is important. But I think that at the end of the day, what actually makes the relationship and what speaks to a competitiveness agenda, it's not a piece of paper that three countries negotiated and came out with. You know, and in fact, in that, you're probably going to see a lot more protectionist stuff in there than you're going to see actual trade liberalization. But what brings it to life, like what actually recognizes the potential of North America, it's not like 1,000 pieces of paper on a trade deal. It's actually companies like Nadia's and companies that all of us work with who actually bring it to life and make North America what it is. And governments can either facilitate that by negotiating good trade deals and by putting in place good policies, or they can put roadblocks in place by certain domestic policies that they take or other measures. So yeah, I think it matters and that it continues to facilitate the relationship, but was it earth-shattering, you know, a landmark, you know, groundbreaking thing. No, but I think that's also because we've been trading together under NAFTA for so long.
Go
Can
ahead, Nadia.
I just jump in just because I have to wholeheartedly agree, and I frankly think that it's almost beneficial, in my view, to have that kind of cycle, to have that ebb and flow where certain issues are prioritized more by governments, because it does actually create space and leave space for companies and businesses to take up the mantle. Is that how you say it? I'm really bad at sayings. Take up the mantle to discuss these issues, right? I think that oftentimes when it is in the context of a trade agreement or a summit or something that's kind of manufactured by governments, it doesn't leave a lot of space for companies and businesses to actually dig in and get to the practical pieces of it, right? And so I think that that's actually an opportunity. And I have to say that I agree with Andrea that, maybe it's not landmark and monumental, and, having worked with Andrea and others on TPP when we were concluding the TPP and doing all of the work to make sure that people knew how monumental it was, I can say that, regardless of whether something is effectively marketed as monumental and groundbreaking and etc., it doesn't take away from the potential and the benefits for it to actually move the needle forward, right? Maybe not immediately, but in sequential years. So I think, to answer the question head on, I do think it matters, and I think that the ebb and flow of how the public in general, or countries, governments in general, might think it matters is okay. It leaves space for others.
Well, let me take that too and touch on a few of these other questions, but just kind of staying there for a moment and before turning to some very discrete and specific issues. Do you think the business community, we're all recovering government people, right? And we're all working with companies now. Do you think companies have changed their focus, particularly over the last year and a half or so, or maybe starting with the China tariffs and disruption of supply chains, and now the very real, and maybe you can go back to Fukushima and other things. Do you think companies are saying, we got spread, and I know, Sergio, you touched on this, we got spread long and wide to some degree. Let's hunker down on North America and get this right. On, for example, Sergio, I think your slides alone on pharmaceuticals, electric vehicles, you have the capability. If you look at Quebec in particular, Quebec on the materials, the minerals needed for electric vehicles is loaded with those. Because you could actually build it's kind of a myth that you need overseas to have an entire EV lithium ion industry here, with Quebec, with Mexico, in the United States. But do you think companies are kind of coming back around to that, saying, cost isn't it, price isn't it anymore, that we need to be safer and secure in North America, and let's kind of hunker down and redouble our efforts here, if that's required, as you said a moment ago, that it's going to be the private sector that needs that. Is the private sector there, or is it going to be kind of, when this opens back up, let's go back to lowest cost destination kind of thing?
I think that companies are thinking about reducing risk. That's what they're looking at, how to reduce risk. But there is a combination now where the government is looking at it. And the government, particularly the US government, has engaged with a very ambitious effort into looking at this in detail, and is consulting with private sector. So if some companies are not looking at this, the government is asking them what they think, because the government is going to make, the US government is going to make decisions on legislative and policy proposals on this front. So I think the discussion is out there. I think we will hear a lot of that in the following months. Companies are thinking on that, but the ones that are not, the government is asking them. So this is going to be a very relevant discussion. I don't know where this will end, I don't know how far we will go, but this is going to be part of the central discussion in North America in the following months.
Any other comments? Andrea, Nadia, anybody want to touch on that one?
I think the only thing I'd say is I think you're going to see it is on things particularly with respect to healthcare. And I'd say probably also EVs, you already touched on this, I think, but I believe that that's going to get driven by the government, where we don't want to get caught again, where we've got supply coming from abroad that's easily restricted. And I work with lots of companies who are focused on this right now, and they're very worried that the memory of what happened in the last year with respect to access to things like masks is going to be short, and that lowest cost driver is going to be back. And it'll be a little while, but that it'll be back in 3 to 4 years, making a number of investments that companies are making, banking on sort of reshoring, potentially at risk.
Nadia, any comment there, or is that you want to stay out of that one?
I was actually just going to make the point that Andrea just made about, I think that it'll depend on how long people's memories are, right? And memories tend to be short. I would also just add, and not necessarily from a manufacturing standpoint, but it depends on the sector, because in the agri-food sector, for example, absolutely, in terms of food manufacturing, the North American partnership is important, 100%. And certainly over the past year and a bit, well, now over a year, this idea of food security and supply chains as it relates to our food is certainly of great debate in Canada and in the United States, and I'm sure in Mexico, although I don't know as much about Mexico. But from a core business perspective as well, if you take a Maple Leaf Foods, for example, the United States is our biggest partner when we talk about our supply chain, but also our biggest competitor, right? When you talk about actual business, right? When you talk about our actual, what we actually sell. Latin America, not a lucrative market for us, and so all roads, Africa, they supply their own, they kind of eat what they make, and so, and other difficulties there. So all roads for us point to Asia. And as exporting from Canada, so making the stuff and then exporting to Asia becomes more difficult, and in China in particular, the conversation absolutely does become, okay, well then, as to Sergio's point, how do you then mitigate risk? Do you mitigate risk by not making the stuff at home and then exporting some of it? But do you mitigate that risk by setting up your manufacturing overseas in Asia, right? To use my example. And so those conversations absolutely, I think, are going to become more important as sort of trade tensions and barriers to export, in particular in the agri-food space, continue, especially in Asia.
Understood. That's interesting. In terms of we have a few minutes. We've got about 6-7 minutes left. I want to do a fire drill round here, just very quickly. A few questions that have come in. Sergio, kind of a very quick, do you think that the labor cases we've seen in the last few days here, was that to get those in before the Free Trade Commission, before the testimony, the Finance, Ways and Means, or do you think we're going to see a series of these kind of over time? Are the hits going to keep on coming, so to speak, or are we going to see a couple now, let's see how it goes, and that was political as much as it was practical, or what do you think we're seeing on the labor side here?
Well, I think my answer would be yes to both. So obviously, the timing for these two cases was the hearings and the Free Trade Commission, but I think we'll have a lot of them in the future. There is a strong political need on the Democrat side to have these cases out there. The biggest challenge here, Dan, is that the obligations in the agreement, most of them, the ones that could be challenged, the example of GM is very clear, are for the unions. So in the GM case, the complaint is that the union, in a April process where they were making a vote on the collective bargaining agreement, proceed wrongly. But the final penalty would be to the GM plant in Silao, not to the union. So that is the most important challenge in the labor obligations. So companies have to understand that they have to have a dialogue with the unions, and they have to have the temperature to understand how is the labor relation going, because they can get surprises. I know that this was a big surprise for GM. Everything was supposed to be going fine, and suddenly the union did something wrong, and they have this case. The other problem that we have on the labor front is that Mexican law says that companies cannot interfere in the union dealings. So companies have the challenge to make sure that everything is right, but at the same time, they cannot interfere in the process because that they can be accused. So there is a methodology to do this. There is a way to take the temperature of how the union and the human resources are in the company. There's a way to map potential gaps to obligations, but companies have to do their homework, and they have to get somebody in there and look at what's going on to avoid any surprises. We will have several cases, unfortunately, Dan, and we will have them through the rest of the year, and I guess through the rest of the implementation of the agreement. We will have these. They come and they will stay for long. That's my reading.
Understood. And I think your comments as well. I just encourage all of our clients and companies that are joining. Sergio's comments on the outsourcing law is a big deal. You need to take a look at your bylaws, your transportation contracts, any of your Mexico addendum to make sure that you understand. I'm switching gears very quickly from the labor USMCA, but to the outsourcing piece. Labor management relations, employee relations in Mexico is huge right now, as it always has been, but this is a very important time. Andrea, very quickly, while we're on the people issue, when's the border with Canada opening back up?
Oh, I just did it. I didn't unmute myself. I defer that question to Nadia.
Everybody wants a punt on that one. Well, let me put it this way. Over under July 1st, you think we'll see any changes?
Absolutely not.
Okay. All right.
Nope.
Well, that's optimistic. And our great friends at Lori Troutman at the Border Policy Research Institute, NASCO, the Future Borders Coalition are monitoring this, and we're watching it very closely here in North America. Go ahead, Andrew.
Sorry, just I'll add a little bit of nuance there to my snarky comment about not reopening the border fast enough. I do think you will see some changes made in the coming months to acknowledge that certain people have had vaccines. And so while the border will not be reopened, I believe that you will see some form of reopening to people who have had at least one vaccine, which will reduce or perhaps eliminate the hotel quarantine restriction in Canada. But full reopening, I don't think I see until the fall.
Okay.
There's also not a lot of political pressure here to do it. Sorry for sneaking that in.
No, not at all. And just as we wind down, I'll just kind of go around the horn, starting with Nadia, then Sergio, then Andrea. Any final thoughts as we look ahead, and then we'll wrap up here. Any final comments? Sorry to put you on the spot there, but kind of concluding comments.
No, I was just going to make a funny remark to your border question and say I'm going to use a West Indian / Caribbean saying, "Soon come." So when it's going to open.
I like it. Sergio, any comments from you?
No, just to say that this is a new agreement. This is a new world. This is a new North America. We have an administration that is looking to this agreement in a very different way than we saw in the past 30 years. The same in Mexico. The administration in Mexico is looking at the agreement very differently. So the private sector has two big roles here. One is to be very carefully looking at what's going on in the regulatory environment and make sure to adapt fast to what's happening. And the second one is to monitor the agreement and to try to protect it and keep it credible and strong. Because governments are distracted with a lot of issues now. I'm not sure they will put always the energy that we saw in the past to this.
Thank you. Great comment. Andrea, any final thoughts?
Maybe I'll just add something that I meant to say in my earlier comments. I think that one thing I'm watching and I'm a bit concerned about is the distraction that COVID is for our border agencies, and the fact that pivoting on to protect human health is going to be a distraction that's not going away in the near term. And so that modernization agenda, that how to make the border more efficient agenda, financial resources, I think are going to be a little bit of a challenge. I think the borders worked incredibly well in spite of the pandemic, but I think that distraction, I think we're all going to feel for some time to come. And it's incumbent on all of us and all the amazing organizations that you just mentioned who work on making the border work more efficiently, on keeping up our pressure on all of our border agencies, but also on governments to ensure that the border agencies have the resources necessary to continue to modernize, but also to protect human health and safety. And just, thank you to you, Dan, and to Thompson Hine for hosting today. Really appreciate it, and always glad to be with all of you.
No, and that's a perfect ending place as well. As just first and foremost, thanks to all of you, to you, Nadia, Andrea, and Sergio for being back with us. I hope that we're doing this the next time in person. I think there's just a large plate of issues right now, and you all covered those masterfully. We could spend our entire day talking about energy issues or Buy America or what have you, but I think putting it in the broader context is important. So thank you with the deepest sincerity. Also, for those of you that stayed with us to the end, it's not a surprise for me. You're probably waiting for your continuing legal education code. For those of you that hung out for the last few minutes. So here is the CLE tracking code. It's CLE 5.12. CLE 5.12. So that's Charlie Lima Echo 5.12. And then just as a reminder, if you're going to be getting a notice from us within the next 48 hours or so, or probably less, with this presentation. Also, Thompson Hine has really real-time information on our thompsonhinesmarttrade.com. We're also doing a series of training sessions, compliance sessions, etc. Maturity scorecard for where you are on various compliance for companies out there that are interested in having a more targeted session. And so we look forward to continuing to be with you and sharing information in this very busy time and what's going to be a very busy Q2 and Q3 on the trade front. So thank you again for joining. Thank you again to our speakers, and we'll see you soon. Stay safe out there. We're adjourned.